When you think of the IMF, what comes to mind? The savior of the world economy. Or, look, let me tell you a number and keep this number in your mind forever. $1.4 trillion. Yes, you heard that right. $1.4 trillion. This is the money that developing countries spent in 2023. Just pay attention, just to pay the interest on their foreign debt. I'm not even counting the principal, just interest. Over $1 trillion just for interest. Think about it now. How many schools could have been built with this money? How many hospitals could have been opened? How many kilometers of roads could have been paved? But no. This money goes into the pockets of creditors sitting in those shiny skyscrapers in Washington, London, and Paris. It just evaporates into thin air. Okay, you took a loan. You'll pay it back. Makes sense. But we're not seeing just this part of the story. Here's the real thing. For every $1 given to the Global South, $14 are taken back. How? Through underpriced exports, overpriced imports, and profits pocketed by foreign investors. Over the last 60 years, $62 trillion, yes, trillion, has been extracted from poor and developing countries and transferred to the banks and companies of first world countries. And right at this point, here it comes. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the global debt enforcer. They told us the IMF is a savior that countries turn to as a last resort. But in reality, it chains these countries. Tighten your belt, give up your sovereignty, do what we say if you want to survive, it says. Let's look at the UN's numbers. The developing world is $31 trillion in debt. Well, the US debt is $38 trillion. It's not that bad, you might say. But hold on. There's a massive difference between the US and these countries. The US doesn't suffer from this debt at all. But these countries? No matter how much aid they receive, no matter how many reforms they implement, the debt keeps growing, and ordinary people keep getting poorer. Right now, 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress, meaning these countries can't pay their debts. And the result? Governments spend more money just paying interest than they spend on their own people's education and health. Just interest. Always the same story. A country runs out of money. The IMF comes, says, "Don't worry, we'll save you," and offers a loan. But along with this loan comes a thick file. You'll manage your economy like this file says. You'll sell this, you'll cut that, you'll remove the other. When you look at the real numbers, you get scared. You know what independent evaluations say. Countries under IMF programs grew 1.5 percentage points less than the IMF's own projections. This isn't a small deviation. It means they're sinking when they should be recovering. Now let's look inside the IMF. There are 190 member countries. But a single country, guess which one, can use veto power on every important decision. The United States. The global North has 9 times the voting power of the global South. So on paper, it's a global institution. But in reality, the board of directors of the world's richest economies honestly seems like the modern version of colonialism to me. By the way, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. Because these kinds of stories are things you need to know. If you want to understand how the system works, you're in the right place. Anyway, as I was saying, colonization never ended. It just changed form. They used to come with armies. Now they come with debt, with interest, with policies written thousands of kilometers away. And to understand how this system was established, we need to go back to those days when countries gained their independence. Mid-20th century. The world holds its breath. After decades of war and oppression, freedom is finally approaching. Between 1945 and 1960, many countries in Asia and Africa broke free from their European masters. But being free on paper doesn't undo the destruction of centuries. The borders they received, random lines drawn in comfortable offices thousands of kilometers away. Tribes split in half, enemies brought together, economies hollowed out. When freedom came, they had nothing. No industry, no infrastructure, no capital. Those who say, but the colonizers built infrastructure, I laugh at them. You know where the railways they built went? Straight to the ports. They weren't built to develop the country. Those rails were built to efficiently extract resources out. When independence came, economies collapsed. The colonizers left behind only debt and chaos. So what do you do in such a situation if your country is bankrupt before it even begins? You borrow. You have to. And right here, the IMF enters the stage. 1,499 delegates from 44 countries gather in Bretton Woods, an American resort town. The goal? To rebuild a world shattered by war, to design a new financial system so such a disaster never happens again. Two giant institutions emerged from this meeting, the World Bank and the IMF. So who was the brain behind all this? Harry Dexter White. The man's story itself is interesting. Born into a poor immigrant Jewish family, saw economic struggle as a child. Didn't go to university until he was 30. But once he started, wow. Graduated from Harvard, entered the U.S. Treasury, became one of the most powerful economists of his time. At Bretton Woods, he sat down and designed the system that would determine the fate of future generations. And the IMF actually started with good intentions. It would save countries in crisis. It would provide short-term loans. It would provide stability. When a country's currency crashed, when exports didn't cover imports, it would step in. It would provide temporary help. Temporary, okay? That's the key word. But as history has shown us time and again, temporary can stretch into decades, into generations. The 1970s came and the world turned upside down. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. Oil prices skyrocketed. Markets went into shock. Developing countries took on massive debts to stay afloat. By the time we reached the 1980s, debts had spiraled out of control. A perfect storm had formed. Policy mistakes at home combined with contradictory moves by rich countries turned a liquidity problem into a full-blown debt catastrophe. From Eastern Europe to Latin America, the dominoes fell. The IMF took the stage. We'll save you, it said. But the game had changed now. This time they came with heavier chains. They gave it a name, Structural Adjustment Programs, SAP. They promised stability but enforced submission. New loans pulled countries into a spiral of dependency. Each loan brought new conditions, more reforms, tighter control. Governments were now writing IMF demands into their budgets, not their own priorities. That's when it was born. The IMF debt trap. Once you're in, you can never get out. SAP was a long list. If you wanted money from the IMF or World Bank, you'd check every box. You'd devalue your currency. You'd cut public spending. You'd sell state companies. You'd remove rules protecting local industries. You'd redesign your tax system the way creditors wanted. These economies showed growth on graphs, but it was hollow. Jobs were disappearing, revenues were drying up. Local factories couldn't compete with the flood of imported products pouring into the country once trade barriers were lifted. Exports increased, yes, but only raw material exports, low value-added sectors. The profits didn't stay home, of course, went into the pockets of foreign companies. Meanwhile, city storefronts filled with luxury imported products. But unemployment was rising, wages were falling. It was a strange type of prosperity. It only existed on paper. So who were the real winners? A select handful of business people who got into exports, trade intermediaries, and transnational corporations that scooped up state assets on the cheap. Criticism of SAP increased, of course, but the IMF didn't abandon the idea. It just made it more subtle, more dangerous. It gave it a new name, conditionality. It sounded more reasonable than SAP. It would pull countries out of crisis, protect the IMF's money. But as the years passed, the conditions hardened. If you want a loan, cut public spending, raise taxes, remove subsidies, privatize companies, reduce social programs, open markets to foreign investors. Once you signed, you had no right to say no. Each installment was tied to new targets. Couldn't meet a target? The next payment froze. The threat of economic collapse. That's how the IMF took control of entire countries. Each new condition deepened the control. Governments were forced to reshape their economies. Unemployment rose, revenues fell, costs of basic services skyrocketed, taxes, pensions, social security. Everything was redesigned for debt repayment. Creditors were the priority now, not the public. Rights were pushed aside. Inequality grew, poverty spread. The poorest paid the heaviest price. And it didn't stop there. The budget allocated to public services was usually the first thing cut. Entire generations grew up during austerity, less educated, less healthy, and lacking the capacity to contribute to the economy. If you want to see the real numbers, look at Zambia. In 2018, debt repayments were 20% of the national budget. In 2021, it jumped to 38%. In the same period, the share allocated to health fell from 9.5% to 8%. Education, it was 17% in 2016, dropped to 12% in 2022. This is what happens when debt becomes a priority. The more you pay creditors, the less you invest in your own people. Today, economists call what the IMF is experiencing mission creep. It now tells countries how to manage their economies, what to sell, what to cut, even how to write their laws. It started with currency adjustments. Now it interferes in everything from privatization to trade liberalization to banking laws. Each IMF loan is a checklist. Each box checked means the country loses a bit more of its own control. And no place felt this pain more than Africa. The so-called reforms were supposed to bring prosperity. Instead, they choked the economies. The bitter truth is this. The number of people living in absolute poverty in Africa today is twice what it was decades ago. From 1979 to 1992, the continent's GDP grew less than 1%. 13 years of reform, zero results. Investments collapsed, factories closed. The continent's share of world exports fell by more than half. Africa once supplied more than a fifth of developing countries' agricultural exports. By 1990, this rate dropped to just 8%. The fall in the manufacturing sector was even sharper, from 8% to just over 1%. For many countries, recovery programs didn't rebuild the economy, they hollowed it out. When markets opened, they said opportunity would come. You know what came? Foreign giants walked in, bought the ports, public services, resources. The continent opened up, wealth flowed out. The numbers are terrifying. $88.6 billion leaves Africa every year, nearly 4% of the continent's GDP, gone without anything being built, without development. Money that could build roads, hospitals, schools is escaping through illegal channels. The continent opens its doors to foreign investment, sells its minerals, its ports, its energy, loses the wealth it needs to grow, a leak that never stops. What's worse, this capital flight makes the government even more dependent on loans. A vicious cycle. Governments stuck in IMF programs are under pressure. You'll meet fiscal targets. You'll balance the budget. You'll pay debts on time. When revenue falls short, first health gets cut, then education, then the social safety net. Each adjustment completes the IMF's list, but citizens pay the price. Across the continent, the same pattern. Austerity balances the books but kills the economy, drains public investment, weakens local industry, leaves society more fragile than ever. The truth is this: structural adjustment programs were never designed for Africa. They were written to protect Western creditors and foreign investors. Just look at the leadership structure. For 65 years, the IMF has always been led by someone from industrialized Europe. That's how structural adjustment began. A system that promised reform but rewrote entire economies. And this chain of inequality didn't just stay in the global south. Once the system proved profitable for a handful of people, it was exported elsewhere. A similar thing happened when the Soviet Union fell. When former Soviet economies were told to open up, it was marketed as freedom. In reality, it was exploitation wrapped in promises. The IMF formula that reshaped Africa and Latin America found its new testing ground: Russia. This time, the name was shock therapy. 1992. Boris Yeltsin and his Western-backed economists hit the button. Overnight, prices were freed, industries were sold, government spending was cut. The goal was to build a free market quickly. The result? The most horrific economic collapse in modern history. A superpower went into survival mode in months. Prices exploded, wages froze, savings vanished, shelves filled with imported products, but no one could afford them. Poverty skyrocketed, crime increased, life expectancy dropped. Factories that fed millions of people closed. While the economy burned, a few men got rich. They sifted through the ashes. They bought oil, gas, steel, banks for almost nothing. That's how oligarchs were born, from the wreckage of a broken system. Russia had everything, actually. Natural gas, minerals, metals, skilled labor force, massive industrial infrastructure. But shock therapy turned this strength into weakness. The industries that turned resources into manufactured goods collapsed overnight. Steel, aluminum, machinery sectors were destroyed. The collapse of the Soviets meant new countries that were once close economies were now being dragged to the economic precipice. And unsurprisingly, the IMF rushed to help. Zambia faced the same scenario. The country's lifeline, copper mines, were privatized under IMF pressure. Sold to foreign firms, efficiency was promised. What came was unemployment, lost revenue, and loss of control over resources. These privatizations were carried out under IMF-backed plans that demanded foreign investment at any cost. The state sold mines below their real value. Multinational corporations came with tax exemptions and profit guarantees. Local ownership vanished. Zambia, once the world's third-largest copper producer, started earning less from exports than Chile. Because profits flowed abroad, civil society organizations begged. The government tried to fix tax laws, but the damage was done. On the other side of the ocean, Argentina experienced the same scenario. In the 1990s, key industries were privatized under IMF guidance. Money flowed for a while. Then came the collapse. By 2001, banks froze. The currency collapsed. Millions fell into poverty. And all of this happened under the supervision of an IMF-approved program. The story repeats. Different continents, same formula. People think the IMF is a global safety net, an international lender that saves countries in trouble. That's the story we're told. Economists, politicians, financial experts repeat the same line. The IMF exists to stabilize economies. But the facts on the ground don't support this. The truth is this. The IMF was never about fixing numbers or balancing budgets. History shows that this is part of a larger system designed to protect the interests of the world's most powerful nations. So I ask you, when the IMF talks about reform and stability, do you still believe this is about saving economies? Or is this just about protecting the interests of the powers that already rule the world? If you've made it this far, leave a chain emoji in the comments. Let's see how many of us are aware of these debt chains. And if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to like the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my future videos. Click the bell icon. Keep notifications on. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.